Please welcome Nick Nowalk.
As we get started, could I get a couple of volunteers to just kind of take one of these, pass one around? There you go. There'll be another one coming a little later. Am I on now?
Oh, it was on before.
I was on before. Am I still on, or did I turn it
No,
off?
click it again. Hold it
Click it
again.
again.
There you go.
Now it's good?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. It is so good to be with you guys tonight. This is a strange talk to give for a bunch of reasons. One of them is just personally, there are some alumni here that I know and who know me. Some of you might know who I am at this point, but very few of you who are undergrads know me well. And I recognize very few of your faces at this point. That's strange because about 12 years ago, Don Weiss and I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts at the same time. We literally met in that season like a week before we got here, and we started ACFA together 12 years ago. About 4.5 years ago, I went back to New York City, where I grew up, and I've been working with Columbia students since then. But it's just amazing to see. I still remember the first DOXA we ever did. There were like 14 students there. It was the second year of ACFA. There was just one dude with an acoustic guitar. And I married him to his wife a few years later. I've done a lot of ACFA weddings over the years. And this is a community that's very near and dear to my heart. And so it's always really moving for me to come back here, but also kind of strange to come back and just know that you don't know me, I don't know you very well, but I love this community, and I'm so glad to be with you tonight. So a couple of reasons this is a strange talk tonight, and for the sake of time, I want to get going. There's just a lot to do, and this is part of what makes it strange. On the one hand, this is a really personal talk, because anytime you talk about suffering, that's personal. It's not an abstract idea. And much of my own interest in the book of Job, much of the reason I am a Christian, much of the reason I struggle with being a Christian and doubt being a Christian, has to do with suffering and my own experience of suffering, seeing other people in the world experience suffering in certain ways. And so on the one hand, this is a really, really personal talk. Let me pull my notes up here. On the other hand, the book of Job is a massive book. It's 42 chapters long. It is incredibly controversial and debated what it even means almost in every section of it. And there's going to be moments tonight that are going to feel like you're trying to drink out of a fire hydrant. I am going to throw a lot of information and a lot of concepts at you. And so let me just say a couple of things. One is that one of my goals is that whether you have already suffered in ways that really feel overwhelming and make you question the existence, the goodness, the love of God, whether you are right now. There's probably people in the room who are getting out of bed every day, and what life feels like right now in this season is unbearably painful and hard. And for every single one of you in the years and decades to come, there will be things that are so painful and so hard you cannot even imagine it right now as you get older. And so wherever you are, whether this is to help you grapple with something you've already experienced, whether this is to give you some, hopefully, encouragement and some new directions to imagine and think and conceive of God and who you are, and in some ways even the world we live in, or whether it's just preparation for the future, I hope that this is really practical. But on the other hand, because the book of Job is so endlessly complicated, because suffering is so complicated, and the world is so complicated, in one way, I want to give you some keys and give you some stuff that I hope is helpful tonight, but I also want to do something that I wouldn't usually do as much, which is this talk is a bit of a means to an end. Part of the goal of this talk is just to equip you to be able to be better readers of the book of Job on your own in the future. And one of the things I think you'll understand a little better by the end of tonight is you need to read the book of Job, not dozens, hundreds and hundreds of times to even begin to understand what it's saying. It is an incredibly complicated book. I think it's one of the 2 or 3 most difficult books in the entire Bible to understand. And there's always debate about everything. Scholars disagree on anything. But everybody kind of agrees what Ephesians is about. Everybody kind of agrees what the book of Proverbs is about. Even what the basic message of the book of Job is saying, there is no agreement on it at all, let alone what the individual parts of it mean. And so I want to give you some kind of interpretive keys tonight. And hopefully that's encouraging in and of itself, but I also hope that you'll be motivated and encouraged and also feel a little more equipped to tonight, this weekend, next week, next year, a decade from now, pick up the book of Job and have a little more sense of what's going on than you otherwise would. I think this is one of the, it flows out of my claim earlier, that I think it's one of the 2 or 3 most complicated, difficult books in the Bible to read. I think it's one of the books of the Bible that you are almost bound to not be able to understand very well if you try to read it on your own without the teaching of the church guiding you. And so I'm excited to get into this. And so out of my own experience, which I'm not going to talk about very specifically tonight, but I'll start with this, and then we'll open up the book of Job. If you have the book of Job on a phone, in a hardcover, feel free to turn to chapter 38. I'm going to give you an overview of the book of Job at the beginning, but we're going to spend all of our time, and you might know nothing about the book of Job. You may have already read it 100 times in your life, and a lot of you are somewhere in between there. But maybe you're aware that at the end of the book, God speaks out of the whirlwind to Job, and he speaks for over 3 chapters, and this by itself should be enough to capture your attention. It is the longest speech of God in the entire Bible. So if you're a Christian or you're just checking Christianity out and you have any sympathy to the idea that the Bible is a revealed truth of who God is, this is the longest self-disclosure of God in history at the end of the book of Job. And we're going to spend all of our time after the first couple of minutes looking at that. But let me say this to set this up. I turned 40 this past summer. I know you think I don't look like it, but I turned 40 this summer. I was 28 years old when I got hired by Christian Union to come start HCFA with Don Weiss. And this summer I turned 40. And I also became a Christian when I was 18, about your age, my freshman year in college. And there's a whole lot that's happened in those years. And I'm not going to flesh this out super specifically tonight. If you want to come back to the office later tonight, we're going to do a seminar tomorrow morning, which in part will just be a room to ask questions about this. I'd be happy to share more. But as I turned 40 this past summer, not that this is a new idea for me, but it kind of crystallized for me that my life has turned out not at all the way that I thought it would or the way that I hoped it would. Most of my 20s and 30s, humanly speaking, in terms of when I was your age, when I was younger than you, what I hoped my life would look like has largely been not what my life has looked like. G.K. Chesterton, who's somebody I would recommend you read if you've not read him yet, said that humans are never more human, reflecting God's image, than when joy is the major note and sorrow and suffering are the minor note. And my life has largely looked the opposite of that as an adult. Most of my 20s and my 30s were filled with suffering, depression. Most days, I would have rather not gotten up in the morning. It's not to say there was no good there, and especially what I got to experience through friends and through HCFA has been wonderful. I've had chronic pain in my body for years. I can't remember, not just the last day or the week, the last year, where I was awake and my body wasn't in pain. Life has been really frustrating, and so the book of Job has been very personal for me, and for many of you, when you turn 40, hopefully this isn't your story, but a lot of you will have stories that are a lot more painful than you hope they are right now. And the church often doesn't set us up very well to deal with that. And you will all know people whose lives are tragedies. And you all love people in your families and your friends whose lives, if you're just looking at them from the day they were born until the day we die, do not make sense and do not hold happiness within that in any overall way. And as we'll see, the central argument of the book of Job arises in chapter 3. Chapters 1 and 2 are much more famous. That's when all the bad stuff happens to Job. There's kind of the weird bet between God and Satan behind the scenes, all that weird famous stuff. But chapter 3 is the real nub of the book, which we'll look at in a bit. And on it, it starts by saying, "And then Job arose, and he cursed the day on which he was born. And he said, I wish I'd never come into this world. I wish I'd never been born." And that's what suffering, when it's really senseless, when it's really consistent, when it's really overwhelming, that's what it does. It calls into question whether it's even a good thing to exist, whether you even wish that you were alive. And we're going to see that the book of Job deals with this. And so as I start into the book of Job, I want to start with, and I'm going to end with in a few minutes, this same one, that Dante, in his famous work, The Inferno, which finally ends in the Divine Comedy, here are the first lines of the work. And I feel that this is very appropriate for Job, and also just a way of indicating that to some degree I'm also speaking out of my own experience, and not as a professor, not in the abstract, not speculatively. And so Dante begins this narrative of heaven and hell and the meaning of life by saying this. It's kind of the narrator saying at the beginning, "Midway on our life's journey, I found myself in a dark woods, and the right road had been lost. I have felt that many times as an adult, even as a Christian. To tell about those woods now is hard. Metaphor for the seasons of suffering and sadness. So tangled and rough and savage that thinking of those times now, I feel the old fear stirring. Death is hardly more bitter. And yet, to treat the good that I found there along the way also, I'll tell about what I saw. And that kind of sets up what Dante does in the rest of the book. And by the way, this is not the main point tonight, but I do think it's important to say this, especially because I'm skipping in many ways to the end of the book of Job and what God says at the end, that you can't skip everything that happened to Job before then. And you can't skip the process of actually experiencing suffering. You can't have the right idea in your head tonight. I can't give you the right theology and set it up so that life doesn't hurt later on. I cannot do anything so that you will not doubt God, so that you will not, if you experience certain things, wish that you'd never been born or really question whether a good and loving God exists. But there is a framework that we can process these things in, and whether it's before we experience it, while we're experiencing it, or afterwards, to lament it and to move towards hope. And so, as we begin, I'm going to pull out that handout that I gave you, and in very short order, what I want to do is give you kind of a 30,000-foot flyover view of what happens in the book of Job, because when I talk about the end, it won't make sense unless you know what the book is. And again, much of this is to set it up so that you can read this and be motivated to read it and be equipped to read it later on. And again, we'll actually have a little time for Q&A at the end, and I'll be going back to the office if you want to come back. Tomorrow morning, there's more opportunity to talk about this. Chapters 1 and 2 are the prologue. If you have just the structure of Job on the front half. Chapters 1 and 2 are the prologue. At the very bottom, chapter 42 is the epilogue. And right away, this is easy to miss, but it's obvious once you look at it, is these 3 chapters are in prose. Everything else in the book is in poetry. And so, most of the book is poetry. Most of the book is conversation and dialogue, but the beginning of it and the end of it remind us that it's a narrative. And in chapter 1 and 2, there is this kind of fairy tale-ish aspect. Job is ridiculously, exaggeratedly both prosperous in his wealth and his blessings, as well as in his piety and his righteousness. Just everything is perfect in his life, and everything goes wrong. He loses everything. And the majority of the book, and I don't think I'm ruining it for anybody. If I am, it's not even the main part of the book. But at the end of the book, there's a ridiculous reversal, and he gets everything back in a sense, and even double. And so all the animals he loses, all the money, he not only gets it all back, he gets his own health back, but he gets it all back twofold. And in between, from that suffering until God shows up at the end, the book of Job is largely a set of dialogues and speeches and arguments between Job and 3 friends of his named Eliphaz, Zophar, and what's the last guy's name? Bildad. Thank you very much. These 3 guys. And the reason I'm skipping over this is all of these characters in these 3 cycles, chapters 4 through 14 are the first cycle, chapters 15 through 21 are the second, chapters 22 to 27 are the third, is in chapter 28, and this is a chapter I would encourage you to take a look at more closely in the future. Chapter 28 is almost certainly an editorial interlude where the narrator speaks. And the significance of chapter 28 is to say that if you've been listening to what Job and his 3 friends have been arguing about from chapter 4 to 27, none of them have any idea what's going on. They're all idiots. Job's 3 friends, but also Job. Job is right. And by the way, this is always one of the complicated, paradoxical parts of the book of Job. Is Job a positive character or a negative character? And if I put it to you that way, you would probably say, if you know the story, he's a positive character. And in a sense, that's true. But I think we can miss that Job is criticized within the book itself in very significant ways. And the whole context of God's speech at the end is, in one sense, to rebuke Job. And so Job is right. He's justified insofar as he doesn't believe what his friends are saying, which is you're suffering because you sinned. You're suffering because you deserve it. You're suffering because God is teaching you a lesson. You're suffering, but hey, God's going to work all things for your good. They're all giving him the typical religious answers that religious people, including Christians, give to somebody else when they're suffering to make it okay. And Job is right to not believe any of the BS. that his three friends say. But Job doesn't just deny what they're saying, he also sets forth his own proposal for what's going on, and his own proposal is just as wrong as the three friends are. His own proposal not only questions God, but accuses God. It not only laments, but it delivers a final verdict and says, God is not righteous, God is not good, God is a bully. God has done this to me, to be cruel to me, and he delights in the pain that I'm experiencing. He basically says that God is a masochist and a sadist, and he's not trustworthy. He doesn't get there immediately, but he works to that position, and at the end of the book, he throws the gauntlet down, and he not only proclaims his own innocence, and he's right in that he has not sinned in such a way to bring this upon himself, but he also throws God under the bus. And he calls into question the righteousness, the faithfulness, the goodness of God. And in that, Job is mistaken, even though it's a more understandable position. And in chapter 28, the narrator speaks and asks a twofold question, or a question twice. He says, where is wisdom to be found? And the whole point is that wisdom is not to be found either in Job's three friends or in what Job has said. And it sets it up for what God says out of the whirlwind at the end. And so, as we get into, if you turn to the back page on your handout, this sets up the speeches. This is where we're going to spend our time. One of the few things almost everyone agrees on, thank you for putting that up there. One of the few things that almost everyone agrees on is whatever the book of Job finally means. This is the key. What God says at the end is whatever the book of Job means. Whatever the book of Job is trying to say, whether it's a pious and conservative take on the world, whether it's a radical deconstructive take, or anything in between, or something else entirely, and there are thousands of interpretations of the book of Job, whatever it's saying is found here. The problem is that nobody agrees with what God is actually saying, and so we're going to look at this. I'm going to give you 10 tips, and this is on a handout, so you don't have to write it down. I'm going to pass it out to you at the end, so you don't have to worry about it right now. But I'm going to give you 10 tips on reading the book of Job well. But before I do that, I want to make sure that we have a sense of the outline of what God says at the end. So in the first 3 verses, God speaks out of the whirlwind to Job, and that's mentioned twice in the last chapters. And I just want to mention 2 things about that. One is that it was a whirlwind that in chapter 1 and 2 killed Job's entire family. God is identifying with the very force of violence, destruction, death, or maybe a better word would be chaos in Job's experience of the world that ruined his whole life at the beginning. And out of that element of creation, which is no matter how good you are, no matter how much you love God and love other people, there is chaos in this world and it will hurt you if you live long enough. And out of that element of creation, an undeniable feature of the world. And by the way, this is something I'll say at the very end, but let me say it here at the beginning, because probably you're all Harvard students, you probably all know this well enough in theory, but man, is it hard to get this out of our DNA as human beings and as Christians. Whatever else obedience is in the Christian life, it is not a bargain between you and God to get you out of suffering. Whatever else obedience is, it is not a preventative measure if you take it every night before you go to bed, so that the next morning your life won't fall apart. There is no correlation between obedience and you avoiding suffering in your life.
That's good.
Now, if you disobey, you will suffer in some ways that you otherwise wouldn't. But that is not to say the opposite, which is that if you obey, you can prognosticate ahead of time that your life will avoid certain kinds of suffering. That is not in your control as a human being. And that means that we live in a world that is chaotic, a world that is out of our control. Not just out of our control, but one that often comes back to harm us. And God speaks out of that, which among other things is saying that God is taking responsibility for that. God is identifying with that. God's not saying, oh, like you're just, at the end of the day, you actually are just a bad little boy or girl. That's why you suffered. Or, hey, like, no, just scrub your experience. There actually is no bad suffering in the world. God is not only owning that, but he's identifying with it and speaking out of it. And the first thing he says to Job is this, and arguably this is the heading of everything God says. He says, who is this that darkens my design so ignorantly? And that word design is the crucial word. It has shown up several times on Job's lips earlier in the story, earlier in the dialogue, and it always refers to the purpose, the design that God has placed in the world. The way that creation is structured, the way the world works. And Job, along with his 3 friends, has made some very bold very confident, very concrete claims about the design of the cosmos, about the order of the world we live in, and God's evaluation is, who is this ignorant fool who darkens and obscures what is actually going on in the world that I created? And by the way, because there's just not enough time, there's 1,000 things I would love to say tonight that I just can't. But one of the real questions you should have when you read the book of Job in the future is, and you've probably wondered this at times when you read the Gospels and the story of Jesus, or you read anything, really any ancient literature that's true, but especially if you take the Bible seriously, is what tone of voice are you supposed to hear in God at the end of this book? Is this angry? Is this sarcastic? Is this tender but confrontational? Is this uncertain and self-doubting, kind of like a postmodern take on God? God doesn't have too much confidence in what he's doing. That's why he's asking questions, because even God doesn't know. And one of the things you should know about reading a book is the tone of voice doesn't come given to you. You have to interpret something. And I think there are very few parts of the Bible that are more difficult than to figure out what exactly is God's tone of voice here. Is it angry? Is it gentle and tender? But whatever it is, it's not simply patting Job on the back and saying, oh, I understand it's really hard. Like, he is confrontational in some sense to Job, and he is saying, Job, you don't see what's actually going on. You're misinterpreting your own experience of the world. And so the rest of God's speech is, I think, God setting forth a counterproposal for what the design of the universe is. Setting forth a view of how the world actually works and how suffering fits into it. Now, there's two parts to the speech overall. Chapters 38 and most of chapter 39 are the first half of the speech, and then chapter 40, or the second half of chapter 40, and chapter 41 is the second speech. In between, Job says something, which we'll look at in a second, and God makes a second challenge to Job, but the first part of the speech is much longer, and it's broken up into two parts. And the first is this, chapter 38, verses 4 through 38, is, I'm going to call it a walk on the wild side, a cosmic tour of creation structures and boundaries. And again, you have this to take home. You can read it on your own. Maybe you've noticed this. Real quick, this is crucial, I think, for understanding Job well. I think Job, in God's speech at the end, is echoing and interacting with the creation story in Genesis 1. And you probably remember that God creates everything in Genesis 1 on 6 days. Then he rests on the 7th. And some of you have seen this before, some of you haven't. I'm not going to get into it in depth tonight. But the clear logic to the 6 days of creation is on days 1 through 3, God creates the structures or the realms of creation. He separates light from darkness and day from night. He separates the waters above the sky from the waters below, and he separates the land out. And so the world is no longer formless. And then in days 4 through 6, he creates inhabitants to occupy it. He creates animals, fish, birds, human beings. And the two parts of God's speech in the first half follow that structure. The first kinds of things that God shows Job in verses 4 through 38 are the structures of creation. There's no inhabitants, there's no animals, there's no people, there's nothing conscious, no beings. Everything in the first half of the speech is kind of days 1 through 3, but with this difference. It's the dark, dangerous part of creation that he's showing him. The sea, the ice, the snow, the wind, the rain. The elements that, especially in the ancient world, not protected by our modern technology, are the parts of creation that remind you that you are vulnerable, that the world is dangerous, and that you can easily get hurt. We often don't, either because we're land lubbers like me, a city kid, or because we just, are always protected by modern technology, we often don't register with why in the Bible, and so we often miss this, that the sea is such a negative metaphor. It's a metaphor of death, of chaos, and it's because in the ancient world, if a tsunami comes, a tidal wave comes, if you're on some small ancient boat out on the sea, and here's something you'll all realize, if and when your parents in the future, the first time your 2 or 3-year-old child walks by a swimming pool, your heart will stop. Because you will know in that moment, experientially, in a way that you only know abstractly now, water is dangerous. Water is dangerous. And that is part of how God created the world. There is a wild side to creation, an untamed, dangerous side of creation. And in the first part of the speech, he shows Job all of the wild parts of creation. Genesis 1 emphasizes more the order, the rhyme and reason, the goodness, it is good, it is good, it is good. Job, God takes him on a tour of the dangerous parts parts of creation that give us nightmares, that hurt us. And then the second part is a list of, and I just saw the preview just came out, the trailer for Dr. Dolittle with Robert Downey. It's coming out. And in some ways, it kind of reminds me of this part of Job, is he takes Job on kind of a zoological tour of all of these animals, and this is such a strange part of the story, that a big part of what God says to Job is, Job, hey, look at this animal. And hey, Job, look at that animal. And hey, Job, do you know how I created that animal? And hey, Job, do you know how that animal gives birth to children up there in the mountains? And you're just like, what the heck is this about? And by the way, I'll talk about this in a minute, but almost everything God says to Job is in the form of a question. Almost never in the form of a statement. And even there, it raises the question of how are you supposed to take this? So for instance, if you and I were having a dialogue individually, or you were just having a conversation with a friend at lunch, and you just made some, really passionate argument about the position you hold, and if the next thing your friend said was, oh, could you be any dumber? You know exactly how to interpret that question. That's not an invitation to dialogue. That's not a, hey, tell me more about why you think that. That's, you're a moron. And that's what I mean. And a lot of people think that that's what God's questions are about at the end of Job. You moron. Are you able to do what I'm able to do? Do you know how I did this? And the idea that people often get is that God is bullying Job, that he's shaming him. He's being like, how dare you question me, you puny little ant, you're a moron, you're weak. It's kind of like, man, can you imagine a father, responding to the pain or the questions of a 3-year-old like that? That's not impressive. It's not super compelling, but I don't think that's what God is doing with his questions, which we'll talk about in a second. But here's the thing that I want you to notice about the animals. And again, you can read this on your own. The beginning of the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2, is also filled with animals. Job's animals. And they're all either killed or stolen by others in the tragedy. But here's the difference. Every animal in chapters 1 and 2 is domesticated. It's a pet. It's a farm animal. Every animal in God's speech is a wild, untamed, undomesticated animal that is not and cannot be a pet for human beings. They're symbols for the parts of creation you cannot control. They are symbols for your experience of the world that will not simply bow down and do what you want it to do, nor that serve you or have any connection to your own happiness or your own purposes, your own agenda. He's showing Job these wild parts of creation that can hurt him and at the very least have nothing to do with him. They're all wild, undomesticated animals. At the end of this, he mentions the lion, the ostrich. We're actually going to look at the ostrich in a minute. It's my favorite one. But they're all wild, the wild goat, the wild ox, the war horse, all these things that are really powerful and really intimidating to human beings. And for some reason, at the end of this first part of the speech, at the beginning of chapter 40, Job puts a hand in his mouth and says, said enough, I'm not going to say anymore. I'm good. Okay, I'm done talking. God's like, no, you're not. Put your big boy pants on. I'm not done yet. And he goes into his second speech. And so at the end of the first speech, you get the sense that Job has heard enough that he's at least willing to not make any more complaints. That he's not willing to confess that God is good. He's not willing to confess anything more than, okay, maybe I didn't see the whole picture. And so God goes into his second speech. And before I tell you what the second speech holds, at the end of the second speech, Job makes a second response, and it's a different response. And in his second response, and there's even a lot of debate about how you even translate and interpret this, but I'm going to say that Job does two things. One is he not only says, I'm not going to talk anymore, he says, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied. And it doesn't mean that he's happy. It doesn't mean that he likes suffering, but it means that he's heard something, he's seen something that actually makes him want to trust God again. And two, he says, I repent in dust and ashes, not in the sense that, I really did deserve all this suffering. He doesn't repent in that sense, but in the sense of, I withdraw the legal charges I made publicly about you, God. I am no longer trying to bring you into the court of public appeal, put you in the dock, and say that you're unrighteous. I withdraw the charges, and I say, I'm satisfied. And then, again, at the end, there's very few parts of Job that piss off modern interpreters more than what happens at the end, because it feels so cheap. It feels so unrealistic. It feels so untrue to our own experience, which is he's restored and he gets everything back. It seems to be a happily ever after ending, which maybe works when you're watching a Steven Spielberg movie when you're 9, but it's nobody's experience of real life. if you've got your eyes open. And I'm going to make an argument at the end that it is not happily ever after. That's not what the end of the book is. Okay, so in the second part of the speech, and then I'm going to walk through a couple of tips and we'll do some Q&A. If the first part of the speech is difficult to understand, the second part gets even stranger, because the second part of the speech is basically two things. Look at Behemoth and look at Leviathan. And you're like, okay, what's Behemoth and what's Leviathan? What am I looking at here? And not only is it unclear what these are, these creatures are talked about a lot elsewhere in the Old Testament, and they're talked a lot about in intertestamental Second Temple Jewish literature and in early Christian literature. The simplest, most straightforward thing I can say is they are the ultimate examples of chaos monsters in the ancient world. They're the Loch Ness Monster and the abominable snowman. They're the boogeyman in your closet or under your bed. They're the parts of creation that are almost mythological or totally mythological, where like one of them is spitting fire out of its mouth. That's not actually a real animal. There are no animals that spit fire out of their mouth. One looks kind of like a dragon, Leviathan. The other one, some people think it's a hippopotamus or rhinoceros or a whale or dolphin. And there might be, kind of like maybe the Loch Ness Monster, whatever the origin of that was. Maybe it's kind of like the abominable snowman. Maybe somebody saw something out of the corner of the eye, not very clearly, but then mythological overtones were laid over it. That's what Behemoth and Leviathan are. And they are the ultimate reminders that the world is filled with boogeymen, that the world is filled with nightmares, with monsters. And something about what God shows him about Behemoth and Leviathan takes Job a step further, and he moves back to a position of trusting God in a new way. Okay, so there is a lot of strange stuff in this book. So what is going on in it? And when we do these, I know I sent it to you just last night. Are these all going to come up at once, or can they come up one at a time? The next screen, the top 10 list. Cool, so they're all going to come up at once, that's okay. Try not to read ahead, try to just stay in the moment with me. And I've got this. Oh, there you go. Brilliant.
Good job, Anna.
I love it. And I have this on a handout that I'm going to give you at the end. But just so that we stay present in the moment, I just want to walk through them one by one. 10 things you should know about reading the book of Job. First is this is wisdom literature. That is, it's not an abstract, theoretical, philosophical treatise on the character of God or the problem of evil per se. Rather, Job aims to practically disclose the order of creation, that is the way things are. That's what wisdom literature is in the Bible. Wisdom is that which in Proverbs 8 God created the world through. Wisdom is the object of order, design, reason, purpose, logic, coherence in the universe. But now, unlike Proverbs, how do I live a flourishing, successful life? Or, say, Song of Solomon, how do I have a good sex life in my marriage? Or this or that, or Ecclesiastes, how do I deal with death? Job is wisdom with respect to when my life falls apart because of senseless suffering, and it evacuates any hope of joy and happiness. What does it look like to walk through a world like that wisely? That's what the book of Job is for. It's ultimately a really practical purpose, and hopefully this will make a little more sense in a few minutes by the end. But I think there's a very real sense in which the book of Job is not so much about God, although of course in a sense it is. It is much more about the world. The book of Job doesn't tell you anything you didn't already know about God, if you're an ancient Jew. But it tells you a lot about the nature of the world you live in. It encourages you, whatever God is saying in those speeches at the end, he's not saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. He's saying, pay attention to what I did when I made the world. Open your eyes. One of the things that I think is really interesting in our cultural moment right now is how big mindfulness is getting as a movement, as a response to basically suffering, depression, trauma, all of this. In mindfulness, among other things, is the insight that much of your suffering, much of your pessimism, much of your cynicism is in part preventable because you're not paying attention to things, because you're not seeing certain parts of the world, because you're obsessed with this or interpreting this wrongly, but there's also this, or there's another way of looking at the same thing. And in many ways, I would say that the end of the book of Job is the ultimate treatment on mindfulness. It's saying, pay attention, open your eyes, look at what the world is actually like. The book of Job is much more a revelation of what the world is like than it is of who God is. Now, insofar as the Creator created the world, that's going to have implications for who God is. But the book of Job is much more about the world we live in than it is about who God is. And I think that's a true statement. Second one, number 2, the prologue, which I kind of very briefly talked about. If you've never read the book of Job before, here's the prologue. Everything's going right in Job's life. Everything's great and he loves God. And for some reason, God decides to make a bet with Satan for seemingly no reason other than maybe kind of God's own vanity, God's own honor, God's own glory. And he says, okay, yeah, take everything you want from his life. Kill his kids. Kill his family. Take his health away. Get rid of his public reputation so that he's seen as a sinner and as a loser. And take all of his possessions and all of his flourishing away. And of course, as you would imagine, chapters 1 and 2 tend to raise more problems for the goodness of God than they do solve any questions you already had about the goodness of God. And many people, whether they're Christians or not, often read the book of Job and they're like, is that what the book of Job is saying? That when you're suffering and you don't understand why, oh, I told you what. Here's what you need to know. God made a bet with Satan behind the scenes. That's why things have fallen apart in your life. And whether Job is historical or not is an ancient question that Jews and Christians have always asked. And I am not going to tell you what I think about that tonight, just so that I don't distract you. But I do think that Job has, whether you think it's historical or not, it has a parable quality to it. It has that kind of fairy tale-ish quality to it. And just like Jesus' parables in the Gospels are not allegories in which every detail has a one-to-one correspondence to something else, they're stories that have one main point. There is one point the prologue makes and only one, which is we are like Job in that we are not privy to much of what is actually going on in the universe. And so whatever you're going to do when you respond to the suffering in your life, the first thing you know is that you do not have most of the data at hand. Is that you do not have most of the data at hand. That's the one thing the prologue is saying. God never tells, nor does anyone else, to Job, oh, by the way, here's the reason you're suffering. Job never learns what happened in the prologue. And the point for us is, neither will we, at least in this life. I am convinced at this point, maybe I'll be proven wrong, pretty sure I won't, I am convinced that I have no idea why much of what has happened to me has happened to me. I have no idea why my life has taken the shape it has in certain ways. Now, in other ways, I did this, or I didn't do this, and there's some ways to connect the dots. But much of my experience of the world is a mystery to me. And that's because I think I'm seeing it to some degree accurately. Much of what is going on behind the scenes we remain ignorant of, which again is the first theme that God starts in his response to Job. You are ignorant in making these claims about what I'm up to in the universe with these deductions. That's not a call to agnosticism or skepticism, but it is a reminder that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, which is what chapter 28 reaffirms and what the end of the book says again. Okay, number 3, and this is where I'm going to start giving you, I think, some new stuff. If you have the structure of the whole book before you, I want you to notice this. This might seem like a really pedantic point, but I think it's one of the 3 or 4 most important things you can see about the book of Job, which is in chapter 3, it's the beginning of the poetic sequences, and Job speaks. And many people, once you see that there's a cycle of speeches, Job speaks, and then this friend speaks, Job says something in return, then the next friend speaks, and that happens 3 different times. Many people implicitly think that chapter 3 is the first salvo in the first stage of the dialogue, but it's not. Chapter 3 is the pivot of the entire book. Everything every character says from chapter 4 to the end of the book. Job's 3 friends, Elihu, I haven't mentioned it all tonight, I'm not going to, and even God. Every single statement any character makes in the rest of the book is responding to, interacting with, engaging with the claims that Job makes in chapter 3. There's a sense in which, if any of you are philosophy majors, chapter 3 sets forth a thesis, and the rest of the book is an argument about whether that's true or not. And the thesis is this. There are some forms of suffering of which Job experienced that would make it better to have not been born. And that's the argument. Job says, given what I've experienced, I would rather not have been born, but he's also saying more than that. As if you believe in God, you have to. You can't privatize your own experience if you believe in God. And so go read chapter 3. This is one of the 3 or 4 places in the book you need to read dozens of times to really get it into your insides and into your mind so you can read the rest of the book. The rest of the book is a dialogue about chapter 3. In one sense, Job just makes one argument. He says, I wish I'd never been born. My life is so miserable. I am so devastated by the loss of my family and the loss of my trust and faith in God that I would rather this story never started for me. Which, of course, is ultimately what suicide is about. Not that every suicide is just that, but in one sense, that's the core of suicide. But Job is also at the same time saying something much bigger. And I'll give you a hint. If you have chapter 3 open, you can look at it. But the first thing he says is concerning that day, the day on which he was born. And he just goes through it really dramatically. He talks about the day that someone brought news to his dad that his mom had given birth. The night when the cry of young baby Job first pierced the darkness. And he talks about it. And the first thing he says is, with respect to that day, the day on which I was born, let there be darkness. And that should sound familiar to you. It's the first thing God said in the beginning of creation. Let there be light. And Job isn't just making a statement about his own experience subjectively. He's saying, my story is a revelation of everybody else's story. My story, my experience is a revelation of what the whole thing's about, which is, I not only wish I'd never been born, I wish God had never created the world. Suffering makes it so that it would have been better that God had never even created the universe. That's the argument Job makes in chapter 3, and that's what pisses his 3 religious friends off so much. That's what sets Job so diametrically against God in accusation by the end. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, and how this is often, whether this articulate or not, how we experience it that way, when someone becomes, especially through their own experience, very pessimistic about their own suffering, one of the most common things in the history of the world in many, many cultures is to say this: I would never bring children into this world. I would never bring children in this world, which is the flip side of saying, I wish I'd never been born, so why would I bring other kids into it? And by the way, at the very end of the book, that's why the fact that Job and his wife choose to have children again is so profoundly significant. So profoundly significant, because nothing has changed about the world at the end of the book. Job doesn't get his 10 kids back. There's no resurrection. That's one of the reasons there's no happily ever after. I remember hearing a female theologian speak once, and she shared this story as a mother would always be more in tune with than a guy. And she said that after teaching the book of Job and kind of presenting it in the more positive light that Christians often do, just this happily ever after, everything makes sense, is she had 2 young kids at that season of life, and they came up after and said, so Mom, are you saying that if we died, but then you and Dad had more kids later on, that everything would be okay? And of course, that immediately brings into focus, that cannot be what the end of the book is saying. Right. That cannot be what the end of the book is saying. And not only that, and you have to read between the lines, but there's no claim that Job's health was restored at the end of the book. He got stuff back. He got new kids, or he chose to have new children, but the old kids are still dead. And arguably, as often happens after suffering and as you get older, maybe his body hurts the rest of his life, and nothing has changed about the world. And yet he's seen something that makes him want to engage it again. But anyway, Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, great series of books, and he's a great writer overall, hardcore atheist. And he has one character in one of his books, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, say this: the story so far. In the beginning, the universe was created, but this has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. And that's Job's argument in chapter 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Boy, was that a bad idea. Boy, was that a bad idea. So everything moving forward after chapter 3 is not understood rightly if you don't understand it as interacting with and responding to that claim. Now, Job doesn't say anything about God directly, anything about himself directly, anything about his friends, about the world, but by saying, I wish I'd never been born, and in fact, I wish God had never created, there are implications there about who God is. There are implications there about the world. There are implications there about what is worthwhile or significant to be human, and the friends rightly pick up on it. The friends give the wrong answers in response, but the friends pick up that Job is making some crazy claims in that chapter, and Job interacts by defending what he says in chapter 3. And in chapter 28, the narrator says none of them have made a good argument. And then God speaks at the end. And as we're going to see, it's going to be one of the points in a second. Let's actually go to number 4. This is the next one. Number 4. In his speech at the end of the book, God responds to and interacts with the actual dialogue, arguments, and images of Job and his three friends in his speech from the Whirlwind. This is, I would say, along with chapter 3 being central, the other thing that almost nobody left to themselves tends to pick up on their own. Many people think that God is just asking random questions. And if you've ever read the book, you know that Job and his three friends, they're talking about injustice. They're talking about oppression. They're talking about suffering. And God's talking about animals and weather elements. It just seems like God changes the subject, and it seems like he's condescending. If any of you are literature majors or in the humanities, maybe you know the term intratextuality. The book of Job is a pervasively intratextual book, by which I mean, here's the practical way, concrete way to say it. There is not a statement God makes at the end of the book that is not a response to a statement somebody else made earlier. Every single thing God says out of the Whirlwind is alluding to and responding to something somebody earlier said. None of it can be understood in isolation. Let me give you one example of many. One of the first things God says in Job 38 is this. And again, this is just to kind of give you some guidelines to read it in the future. On this tour, in chapter 38 at the beginning of the structures of creation, God says this in verse 8, "Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made cloud its garment, in thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for the sea. And I set bars and doors around it. And I said to the sea, thus far you shall come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed." Propositionally, theoretically, God is making a very single argument there. Yes, there are chaotic elements in the world, but there are limits to it. Not everything is chaos. Chaos is there, but it has limits and it has boundaries, which is true. One of the things you know, whether through your own suffering or the suffering of people that you know, is that sufferers are exaggerators. Sufferers see everything through the lens of their suffering, and everything becomes this. What Job is doing in chapter 3. My experience in this moment of my life is not only the whole story of my story, it's the whole story of your story too. That's an exaggeration. That's a classic exaggeration, and sufferers exaggerate, understandably so. And God is making the point that yes, there is chaos. Yes, there is suffering, but that's not all that's there. But he could have just said that. Instead, he describes the sea as bursting forth out of the womb, shutting doors on it, and having limits. And in Job 3, here's the first thing that Job said. Verse 7 of chapter 3, "Behold, let that night, the night on which I was born, be barren. Let no joyful cry of an infant enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan." Job is the first one who brought up Leviathan in chapter 3. God doesn't bring Leviathan up out of nowhere. "Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning. Because on that night it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb." God is picking up that imagery in the way that he describes the sea in chapter 38. If you do not see that, you do not hear what God is saying. God is responding to something Job said. Every single statement God makes at the end of the book is a response to imagery, implied arguments. It's poetry. It's not prose. It's not a philosophical argument. It's filled with imagery. Even the fact that God talks about animals constantly at the end of the book. Next time you're reading the book of Job, here's a very practical thing. Make a mark every time Job or one of his three friends mentions an animal in their argument. There are dozens of references to animals before God ever mentions one. God's response is not an arbitrary, "How dare you, you moron, you small, puny little idiot." It's an invitation to dialogue, and every question has an implied, "Look again and see something you didn't see when you made this claim before. See something about the world you missed when you made this argument." For the sake of time, I'm not going to give you many of these. And I'll bet that some of you, if you've ever read the book of Job before, you've thought this yourself, but there is no part of the book of Job that doesn't impress modern people, that modern people are more bothered by than God's speech at the end. Let me give you a couple of examples. Virginia Woolf, who I love, great novelist, says this in a letter to a friend. I read the book of Job last night. I don't think God comes out well of it. That's how modern people hear the book of Job. The most famous Old Testament scholar of the 20th century, Gerhard von Rad, Germany, says this. Notice the universal language there, all commentators find the divine speech at the end of Job highly scandalous insofar as it bypasses completely Job's particular concerns, and because in it God in no way condescends to any kind of interpretation of Job's concerns. That is a bad interpretation of what God is saying at the end, but it is common. Even among world-class scholars, if you don't, and this is one of the reasons that in a sense I'm revealing the book of Job backwards, you cannot skip the first 37 chapters and just pick up what God is saying. And this is more than any other reason why, if you want to understand the book of Job, you have to read it dozens of times. You have to read it hundreds of times. The specific images, the specific language needs to be really familiar to you, because every time God says something, he is alluding to something somebody else said earlier. And I'm going to give you a couple of more examples by the end, but I think that's a crucial thing. God is responding and engaging with the actual arguments that have been made earlier. Okay, number 5, I basically already gave to you, so I'm just going to read it. God's tour, at the end, surveys the wild side of a beautiful but dangerous and untamed creation, similar to the flow of Genesis 1. That all the structures and elements of creation, all the animals, are the untamed, chaotic parts of creation. That's what the debate is about. Why is the world like that? Why is the world set up so that kids fall into swimming pools and drown? How can the world be like that if God exists? How can the world be like that if he loves us and if he knows us? That's what God is talking about. Number 6. This is a big one, and I'm not going to go into it, but I just want to give it to you. Throughout the Old Testament, and arguably the New Testament too, there is a view that is profoundly foreign to us as modern people, even if you're religious. Even if you've been a Christian your whole life, it is not in your DNA, and the opposite is, which is that the world is telling the same story that the Bible is. That nature tells the same message that Revelation tells. That natural order, that there's up and down, there's left and right, reflects that there is a moral order in the universe. You can think of Psalm 19, which starts with the heavens declare the glory of God, but then talk about the law of the Lord in the same language. Think about Romans 1, which talks about creation and creator and connects the two. John Calvin in the Institutes of the Christian Religion in the 1500s makes a statement that's so counterintuitive to us as modern people when he says, now we need the spectacles of Scripture and the Spirit, but nonetheless, if you see the world rightly, it's telling you the same thing the gospel is. Which, I'll be honest, that makes no sense to me. That makes no sense to me at all, given my experience in the world. But the book of Job is saying that every time God makes an observation about an animal or something about the natural world, it is that. It's not an allegory. It's not really that. It's something else. But it's more than just that. It's saying there's something about the moral shape of the world that is like the physical shape of the world. And so every argument about the natural order of the universe is at the same time a claim about the moral heart of the universe too. And you have to make that deduction as you go through the book. Number 7. This would probably be the third one. Along with Job 3 being central, with God's speech interacting with it, this is the next one, which is animals are metaphors. No animal is just that animal. And I'll give you a couple of examples, both overall in the Old Testament. We're close to being done here, and we'll do some Q&A. Next time you're reading the Psalms, notice how animals in Old Testament wisdom literature in particular, Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, Song of Songs, but like the prophets do, animals, different kinds of animals, often stand for different kinds of human beings. Predatory animals are often metaphors for the wicked who oppress the poor and the innocent. Animals that are on the outskirts and the margins, hyenas, ostriches, are often metaphors for what today would be like illegal immigrants and minorities who are under the radar and don't have provisions like everybody else. And whatever else is true of Job's story in chapter 1 and 2, he is an insider. He is elite. He has access, he has privilege, and he is not at all concerned with, what about all the people on the margins over here? that I ignored my entire life, or at the very least looked at condescendingly. Animals are often, and then innocent or defenseless animals are often metaphors, doves, things like that, or sheep, lambs, often metaphors for God's people, the righteous, the innocent, the blameless. And if you read this arguments between Job and his three friends, they constantly mention animals. And so I want to give you a couple of examples, and then I'll move on, and we'll close here in a minute. The first is this. God mentions the lions in his speech. I want to mention two animals, the lion and the ostrich. Kind of just sounds like Dr. Dolittle, like, oh, that's interesting, there are lions out there, and there are ostriches. And the ostrich one is particularly goofy, because the scene with the ostrich in chapter 39 emphasizes one thing above all else. If you ever have seen an ostrich, this is true for the ancient world too in observation, ostriches are super goofy. They are super goofy. The way they move, the way they look. But there's also something, whether this is true in a sociological sense, in a zoological sense, is another question, but because they run around and they're so kind of haphazard, in the ancient world, not just in Israel, ostriches in the ancient world had a reputation, and they were a metaphor for the fool and the wicked, because it looked to observers like ostriches abandon their own children and leave them defenseless. And so what God emphasizes when he says, Job, look at the ostrich, is he points to an animal that in its foolishness and in its selfishness, metaphorically speaking, abandons its own children and leaves them defenseless. Because the presumption is it doesn't care. If you go and you read the arguments between Job and his three friends, the children of the wicked are a very, very common point of argument. For a very obvious reason, which is in a modern world where we're all sitting in privilege here, we all tend to think from our armchair seats that there are really simple, obvious solutions to the world's problems, but there never are. And the reality is, and I'm going to end with this in a minute, but I'll say it now because I think it's important for a paradigm. Every moment God responds to evil in the world by not bringing judgment, but showing grace, showing mercy. Beautiful words for Christians. We love when God shows grace. Every moment of grace in the history of the world is at the same time a moment of chaos. Because it gives evil another chance to hurt somebody else. There has never been a moment of grace that wasn't at the same time a moment of chaos. And here's another thing, especially as your generation becomes increasingly, in a good way overall, but very passionate about justice, which is there has never been a moment of justice in the fallen world, which was not also at the same moment a moment of chaos. Because every time somebody goes to prison, he has kids. And every time someone is punished, there are people who depend on him or her. And every time a community is censored by another community, there is collateral damage. And Job and his three friends are all really clear about that, which is there's no dealing with evil in the world without dealing with what goes around it. And Job's three friends regularly make the argument that, hey, even if the wicked don't get what's coming to them in these 30 or 40 years, be patient, Job, their kids will get what's coming to them, and they'll be the ones that deal with it. Which is a pretty heartless argument, and it is. But Job's response is just as heartless, although it's more accurate, which is to say, I've met a lot of wicked people, and a lot of them don't care at all about their kids. And so if they get off scot-free, and 2 generations later, their descendants suffer for them, I am utterly convinced that Donald Trump would throw his own family under the bus if there was any moment that presented itself where it was them or him. That is a classic characteristic of not all, but many wicked human beings. And so Job makes the argument in chapter 21, I not only want the wicked brought into my presence and killed now as an evidence that God is just, I want their kids brought into my presence too, and I want their kids to be killed too. Because the reality is that if you think racism in the South, or if you think this over here, this over there, you can't just deal with the people who are doing it now. Their kids are going to carry it forward. And so if you want justice, you are also asking for chaos to be unleashed on the innocent. And this is, among other things, what God is saying to Job. Whether it's justice or whether it's grace, chaos will be part of the way I respond to the world. This is a feature of the world moving forward. And so, in chapter 5 of Job, and I'll read this real quickly. In chapter 5 of Job, here is one of the first arguments Eliphaz makes. This is the first friend that speaks. And he says this. Job, chapter 4, verse 7. Job, remember, who that was innocent ever perished? I mean, it's almost comical, the arguments that the friends make. They're basically saying that there are people wearing white hats, there are people wearing black hats, and everything makes sense. Job, who that was innocent ever perished? Where were the upright ever cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity, they sow trouble, and they reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. And then here's the next statement. And unless you know how the book of Job works, it seems like he changed the subject, but he didn't. And the next statement is this: the roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, the teeth of the young lions are broken, clearly by God. The strong lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs, the children of the lioness, are scattered also. That's how God rules the world. He destroys the wicked and their kids. Next time you're reading the imprecatory Psalms in the Old Testament, if you've ever not paid attention, the imprecatory Psalms never stop with God bring judgment to my enemy. Go read Psalm 69. Go read Psalm 109. God, wipe out his mother and his father's name from the book of life, and I want to see his descendants begging for bread in the streets. Because if justice is what you care about more than anything else, that has to be part of the implementation. Because people can't be isolated from their families, from their communities. We're not isolatable realities in the world. And so Job's three friends make an argument that God rules the world in such a way where not only the teeth of the lion, but also their kids are regularly broken and they are destroyed. God argues in Job 39, Job, do you understand when you look at the world? And he says this. And sorry, it's at the end of chapter 38, starting in verse 39. Job, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetites of the young lions? When they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their thickets? And who provides for the raven, a predatory bird, its prey when its young ones are crying to God for help and wonder about for lack of food? Do you hear something that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise heard before tonight? There's an argument there, which is when God is thinking about how to respond to wickedness, he is thinking about more than just the person who has done wickedness. He is thinking about their children. And Job and his three friends disagree with a lot of things, but they all agree on one thing, which is if it is what's required for justice to be implemented, we are willing to see the children of the wicked destroyed so that wickedness is put down. And God is not. Because God is not like Job, and he is not like Job's three friends. And when you look at the ostrich running around foolishly, pursuing its own selfish desires, leaving its own eggs and children vulnerable, you're left with a question, which is always what God is doing here, which is if ostriches are constantly abandoning their own kids, how are there still ostriches in the world? Like, this is a one generation and out strategy. And yet there are still ostriches in the world. Why? Why are there still ostriches in the world? And we know a couple of reasons that they're not. One is not because the ostrich cares about their own children, because it doesn't. But also, not because Job cares about the children of the ostrich, because Job has also made clear, I do not care about the children of the ostrich. The only possibility is this, because God cares about the children of the lions and the ostriches. And do you see that when you see evil running unchecked, not immediately judged? Is that what you see in that moment? Is that what you see? That's what you should see. That God is patient. Jesus is not nearly as original as we sometimes think he is. Jesus' significance is that he did it perfectly, reflecting God's image, died on the cross, rose again, but there is nothing Jesus says that somebody didn't say before him. And one of them on the Sermon on the Mount is why you should love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, bless those who curse you, is because you are loved by a Father who causes the sun to rise on both the righteous and the wicked, and who causes the rain to fall on both the good and the evil. That's exactly one of the arguments God is making at the end of Job. That's how I rule the world. And the reality is whether it's Donald Trump over here, whether it's cancel culture and woke culture over here, the reality is that God does not rule the world the way we would if we had power. And that is good news. And the reality is that when we are ruling the world, there's just as much chaos, but towards stupid, wicked, selfish ends. In a fallen world, the only way there is no chaos is if a flood wipes us all out tomorrow. Other than that, chaos is going to be part of the story. The question is why. And for us, the question is, what ultimately matters to you more than anything else? And so all of the animals are metaphors. And by the way, I know we're running out of time, but with the elements, two of the things that he mentions, the sea and the morning. And this is so crucial. And again, this is like the tip of the iceberg for you to go and read this on your own, and I hope this is motivating you to want to really get into the book of Job. Both with respect to the sea and the morning, arguments were made earlier, both by Job's three friends and Job, and as always, kind of contradictory arguments, which is, for Job's three friends, creation, the world, comes across as you read their arguments as if it's kind of one big booby trap for the wicked. That the second you take a wrong turn, a lightning bolt comes out of the sky and gets you. The second you do something good, you get the tooth fairy leaves you money under your pillow. That's what the world is to Job's three friends. That is, there is no sea, and there's just morning all the time. There's no darkness, there's no night. Job makes the opposite argument. This world is a free-for-all. This world is chaos, it is absurd, it is the survival of the fittest, and it is might makes right, and there is no up and down, no rhyme and reason. It is whoever's strongest wins, and it's all luck and all accident. It is a free-for-all. And the reality is that the world is neither of those things. The world is neither of those things. There is room for evil to happen. You have all, including me, gotten away with a lot of evil. And one of the reasons you are, in part, maybe encouraged to continue doing it is that you know it's at least plausible that you will continue to get away with it. And certainly many human beings in the world are encouraged to commit evil because there is room for that. But here's the other thing, and this is what God says about the morning, that every morning the sun comes up and the wicked have to hide again. Most evil happens when the sun goes down. Most evil happens, metaphorically, through the sea, not through the land, and there is space for that because God gives us space, because to take that space away would be to bring judgment, but there's more than that. There is order. There is justice. There are small foretastes of God's kingdom, God's purposes here and now, and when we're suffering, we tend to not look at those. We tend to discount those. Now, when life is going well, you do the same, because people who are flourishing are also exaggerators. And that is a much bigger danger for every single person in this room tonight. Gone to Harvard University, 19, 21 years old, probably you're in pretty good health. You have the opportunities of a lifetime in front of you, and there is a lot of opportunity for you to exaggerate what is going on in your life or in the world. And so there is still night, there is still sea, but there's also morning, and there's also land. And this is what God is saying. And he's also, and let's go on to number 8. And I'm going to end here in real quick order. I'm not going to go into these. Number 8 says, God's rhetorical questions at the end build upon a crucial point of agreement, that God's power is unrivaled and his wisdom is matchless. And this is more than anywhere else, I think, where interpreters of what God is saying at the end go wrong. Most of God's questions have to do with either his power or his wisdom. Job, are you able to do this that I do? Job, do you know how I did this when I made the world? They're all about, Job, are you as powerful as I am? Job, are you as wise as I am? And most modern interpreters, in my experience, think that's the whole point. No, I'm not. Then shut up. And that's kind of what God is saying. But here's the thing, and I've put a couple of passages up there, and this is on your handout, which I'll give to you in a second. Job has constantly affirmed those two things. That God is unrivaled in power, and that he is unmatched in wisdom. But Job has always added a third statement in each of these passages, which is that he uses his power and he employs his cleverness to torment us, to be an asshole. That he's not good. He's powerful, he's wise, but he is a tyrant. And every single thing that God says, can you do this? Do you know how I did this? Is not a conversation stopper, but a call to look at something that Job thinks he already understood and to say, do you know what direction God's power is going with that? Do you know to what end his wisdom has unleashed this on the world? And every single thing is always patience, mercy, care, nurturing. Arguably the dominant image of God in the creation speeches at the end is that of a parent. Like a father or mother, God has given birth to creation. He nurtures it. He cares for it. He feeds it. And I'm going to end with this overall challenge for us. But if either your biggest objection against God and how he rules the world, or your biggest desire in your own life, or what bothers you the most about the world, is that there is oppression and injustice, and holy cow, is there. An unfair, senseless suffering, in such a way that your greatest desire is that justice would be implemented no matter what the cost. Imagine that someday you meet somebody, you fall in love, and your first child is about to be born. And your first child comes out, Job 3, right? This is the ultimate moment of how you evaluate the world, what's going on. Imagine if somebody asked you, why did you decide to become a parent? Why do you want to have kids? And your answer is, so that I can punish them when they do wrong and reward them when they do good. Right? So you're like, oh yeah, you shouldn't be a parent. Oh yeah, that's not what this is about. Now, once life comes into existence, justice becomes part of the story. But justice cannot be the reason it came into existence. Only love can do that. And at the end of Dante, this is what is finally said, and I think it is so apropos of what God is saying to Job. So at the end of Dante, there is a claim that as Dante has, in some ways similar to the end of Job, so much revealed to him of what's going on behind the scenes, but it is also a claim that still most of what's going on he doesn't know. And most of what's there he doesn't see. These are the final lines of the Divine Comedy by Dante. Just so was I on seeing this new vision. I wanted to see how our image fuses into the circle and finds its place in it, what role we have in this world. And yet my wings were not meant for such a flight, except that then my mind was struck by lightning, through which my longing was at last fulfilled. And what Dante is saying there is two things. Like Job, we are always in the prologue. We never get to know what's really going on behind the scenes in most of the details of our lives. But two, what we have seen is enough. And it's enough to satisfy. And what have we seen? And he says this, here powers failed my high imagination. But by now, my desire and my will have been turned away from my grumbling, away from my questioning, like a balanced wheel rotated evenly by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. But what he saw is that what's behind the sun and what's underneath the stars, and what has arranged the animal kingdom the way it is, and what has ultimately been underneath and inside every moment of the universe, is a God who loves everything that he's made, including the wicked, including the foolish, including those who rebel. And that means being patient with evil. That means caring about the wicked as much as the righteous, and that means endless opportunities for more chaos to erupt. There is chaos, there is collateral damage, and you will all suffer in ways that have nothing to do with what you've done or haven't done. There will be things, and if somebody comes and says, this happened because, this happened so that, they're lying to you, and they're an idiot. Much of what happens to you, you will never know why in this world. And by the way, one of the most practical things is don't be Job's friends to other people either. Don't explain what's going on in the prologue behind the scenes because you don't know.
Yeah.
The one thing you do know is that every moment of chaos, there is love and not cruelty or indifference behind it. And in the heart of God, there is a commitment to justice, and justice will finally be revealed in the universe. But the reason, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the moral arc of the universe bends, and it takes so damn long for it to bend that way. It's because justice is not the most important thing. Love is. And at the end of the book of Job, God eventually says, yes, I am all powerful. Yes, I am all wise. But above all else, I want you to see this when you look at the world, that my steadfast love is over all of it in every single moment.
Yeah.
And do you see that when you see the world? And do you realize that means suffering? That means pain. That means injustice. Because the only other option is either the chaos that comes through justice or just wiping us all out. And so at the end of the book, number 9, the final speech is this, and I'm not really going to go into this. I'll give it to you to go home and read. The last 2 animals he mentions are Behemoth and Leviathan, and they're also metaphors. But Behemoth is you. You suffering, you questioning God, and Leviathan is God. And it's on there, and so actually it's on your other handout. But the 2 comparisons that are made is consider Behemoth, which I made just like I made you. And then he says, In chapter 3, Job was so pissed that he dared Leviathan to rise up and to bring more chaos on the day he was born. And God says, in your clearer moments, you would not rouse Leviathan. You would not mess with this monster. Who then is he who can stand against me? And here's two things that happen to all of us when we suffer, and it's happened to me 100 times, which is we become afraid of the world and we stop fearing God. That happens to almost everyone who is traumatized by suffering. In the end of the book of Job, in a nutshell, these two animals remind us of this. We are incredibly fragile. We will suffer in ways that are unfair, that are senseless, that make no sense. But here's another thing that you realize as you get older about human beings made in the image of God. You are far more resilient than you know. There are things that terrify you right now, and that you would do anything in your power and pay any money you have access to avoid happening in your life. And it is the nightmare of your existence of this or this or this would happen to you in the future. Or this or this or this wouldn't happen. But here's the thing, you actually can't handle it. It actually will not be the end of you. You actually are resilient, and it will not be the final chapter in your story. It will hurt like hell. It will leave an impact. There will be a process of going through lament and suffering, but you are far more resilient than you know. And that's the point of Behemoth, which is Job, of everything I ever created, you're the strongest thing. Job, earlier in the book, said, what is my strength that I should endure? What is my hope that I should wait? And then he actually describes himself. Do I have this kind of description of Behemoth? And then God describes Behemoth in that same way. And the whole point is you are resilient. You are strong. And so part of the book of Job is just what the scriptures say over and over again. You do not need to be afraid of anything that is coming in your future. There is nothing that this world can throw at you which you can't get back up from again.
Okay, that's good.
Whether in this life or in the world to come.
Yeah.
It will leave scars on you, but you are resilient and you will get up from it. But on the other hand, suffering also tempts you to start accusing God and to stop fearing him. And if the book of Job says, do not be afraid of anything in the world, do not be afraid of your life, it also says, don't stop fearing God. Give him the benefit of the doubt. Let him be the center of the orbit, and don't let your own interpretation, your own limited perception of the data make you turn away from the one thing you should never mess with in your life. Fear God and fear nothing else is part of the message of the book of Job. And so number 10, the conclusion does not insult our intelligence with a false, cheap, happily ever after, but it simply communicates that Job chose to begin again and to once more engage riskily with creation and its good creator. I'm a bit of a sentimentalist at this point in my life, I suppose, but I think the most courageous and beautiful and meaningful moments in the world is when someone has every reason in the world to give up on other people, every reason in the world to not get out of bed tomorrow morning, and they choose to keep engaging anyway. They choose to get up and to begin again. And here's something that maybe you've never thought about this way before. If the end of the book of Job is not happily ever after, because for all we know, a couple of Job's next kids died too. For all we know, other stuff went wrong because the world is still filled with chaos. And the end of the book of Job leaves no promises that you can avoid this chaos. It just gives you reasons for trusting in God in the midst of it, that there are good reasons for it. But there is another sense in which not only is the end of the book of Job a happily ever after, this is all the resurrection from the dead and the life of the world to come is for Christians. It's not a happily ever after. If you think it's a happily ever after, that's one of the reasons you don't look forward to it. Because you look forward to the chapters of Harry Potter not closing the final page. When God raises you from the dead, he's going to say, do it again. He's going to say, again. And it's going to be in this world, and it's going to be opportunities to move forward and to praise him and to love him and to trust him. And we can start practicing that now. And that's ultimately what the book of Job is about. It doesn't at all disconnect God from suffering. It doesn't at all say, here's a little formula so that you can avoid suffering. But it says, all things being equal, it is worth it that God created this world. And you should be glad that you are alive. And you should be glad that God created the world. You should celebrate that. Not with naivete. Not even in spite of, but in the midst of the suffering that we experience. Because it's good. And it's beautiful, not just as God good, but the world. If you remember, and I'm going to pray, if you remember, Aslan is described by C.S. Lewis as he's not safe, but he's good. I think that's also true of the world that God made. This is not a safe world, but it's good. And you should enjoy your life. You should celebrate. You should love God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind. You should love your neighbor as yourself, no matter what comes. And you should glorify God and enjoy your life forever. And praise Him that He created you and that He created this world. Let me pray. Father, thank you for the book of Job. I'm always aware that my own words are so insufficient. They're so prejudiced and partial and provisional, and they're so inadequate. But I do pray both that this would be encouraging to those who are here tonight, that you would help us to see and to pay attention to something in the world that suffering and injustice often blind us to and obscure, that your steadfast love and faithfulness and your goodness are over all of it, and that you would also help us to, whether it's reading and interpreting and wrestling with the book of Job in the future, or whether it's grappling practically and experientially with suffering, and especially senseless, unjust suffering in our lives and in the lives of others, I pray that you would help us to see and to savor and to cling to that while there are so often moments when we have almost no idea what you're up to or why specific things happen the way they do at certain moments, that we do know that over all of it is your steadfast love and your care as a father, as a mother, as a God who has created us and nurtures us and sustains us, who does not delight in the death of the wicked, but desires that all would come to know you, and that everything in creation would flourish, and therefore are incredibly patient towards all of it, and every morning cause your sun to rise, both on the good and the evil, and the rain to fall on the righteous and the wicked. I pray that when the moments of chaos come and they reveal themselves in each one of our lives, that we would know that behind them is the love that moves the sun and the stars. And that we would not give up hope, that we would not despair, but that we would look forward to you in your good timing, which is patient and slow, not desiring any to be destroyed, not any to lose out. We pray that we would trust that loving heart behind all of our experiences of the world, even when we have so little idea of what's going on. Thank you for being the God who, having once spoken out of the whirlwind, took on flesh in Jesus and went right into the heart of the whirlwind itself on the cross and experienced chaos in our place and for us, because ultimately love is the final word in the universe, because God is love. And so help us to love you and to love one another, and help us to not lose heart. Can we ask all that in Jesus' name? Amen.